Donor conception. Who should know what and when? This event has been made possible thanks to the generous support of Merck. The hashtag for the event is PetDonor. I'm Sarah Norcross and I'm the Director of PET and I'm chairing the discussion this evening. Under current UK fertility law, anyone who donates sperm, eggs or embryos may remain anonymous until a child reaches the age of 18. That's a child resulting from their donation. At that point, the donor-conceived child may request identifying information about their donor. This does not apply in reverse, so a donor doesn't have any reciprocal legal entitlement to know the identity of the child. Meanwhile, there are official arrangements whereby, upon reaching the age of 18, donor-conceived people may learn the identity of and may be made identifiable to donor-conceived genetic siblings, provided there is mutual consent. And for people that were conceived before these rules and this law change came into place, there are other sort of voluntary and different mechanisms for trying to do that. But I have to say, I don't think that any has shown any great success in connecting people. And I think probably our first speaker will speak to that a bit more. Now, there's been sort of a disruptive technology in this area in the form of direct-to-consumer genetic testing, which has made it increasingly easy to circumvent all of these rules. Donors, donor-conceived people, and donor-conceived genetic siblings can now potentially identify one another deliberately or accidentally before the relevant donor-conceived person reaches the age of 18 and without any prior consent. So this has started to happen. The European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology, ESHRE, have published good practice recommendations for information provision for those involved in reproductive donation. Now, in the UK, the government has signalled that UK fertility law could be revised in the near future. And the UK's fertility regulator, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, I'll refer to it from now on as the HFEA, have been considering full possible new legal models for regulating donor conception. So first, there's Status Quo Plus, which has nothing to do with the rock band or double denim, but instead it's pretty much keeping the law as it is now, but with an added legal requirement for clinics to inform donors and recipients of the possibility that genetic testing may lead to identifiability at any time. The second is early identification by consent. So a new system whereby donors can, if they wish, opt formally to become identifiable before the donor-conceived child turns 18. Third, there is the remove anonymity option, a new system whereby donors must be mandatorily identifiable to recipients of their donation from an early stage. That could be from the birth of the donor-conceived child or perhaps even earlier. A timing on that is not clear. And then the fourth one is double track. So create a new system whereby donors can choose either to become identifiable to the donor-conceived child when the child turns 18, as at present, or be identifiable to the recipients of their donation from an earlier stage. So those options were discussed by the regulator and their legislative reform advisory group. And the greatest support was for that fourth one, the double track option. We commissioned a report from Ipsos on fertility, genomics and embryo research, public attitudes and understanding. Ipsos surveyed a representative sample of 2,000 and odd people, and we asked some questions about donor conception, including people's willingness to donate, knowing that they would be identifiable once the donor-conceived person reached 18. And it was interesting that about a quarter of people who'd previously considered donating in an earlier question changed their mind on learning this. So there is an indication there from that survey that there's a reduction in willingness to donate with the loss of donor anonymity. And that has to be sort of factored into policy changes in the future, is to think about, all the impacts that changes may have. And I'm thrilled that we have an extremely knowledgeable lineup for you this evening, a combination of people with lived experience and academics. So we have Dorothy Byrne, Kevin Moore, Nina Barnsley, Dr. Joe Lysons, and Professor Guido Pennings. Dorothy is a parent via donor conception and a commentator on the identifiability of donors. She is president of Murray Edwards College at the University of Cambridge and a former head of news and current affairs at Channel 4.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm really grateful that you've given me the opportunity to talk to such an influential and important group of people. I'm here because 25 years ago, I gave birth to a wonderful baby, and I'm pleased to say all went well, and she is now a very happy young woman. However, she is really, really keen to know who her father is, ideally his whole identity, but certainly more about him. And she says that is essential for her ability to know who she is, and that it is it's the right of every person to know who they are. And how she puts it is, I don't think it's right to stop someone knowing who they are. And I believe she's right. So when 27 years ago, I was thinking about getting pregnant, I went to Professor Ian Kraft, who a number of you will know, and I was actually thinking of using a known donor, but he persuaded me that I should go for having an anonymous donor. And he said that all the research showed that this was better for children because it was less complicated for them. I have since been unable to find that research, and I know that the result for me was good, but I believe that I didn't think through that I was giving up the right of another human being, that is my baby to be, to know her identity and also to know key medical facts potentially about her life. And my daughter has had a medical condition that is not a terribly serious one, I'm glad to say, but one which has a hereditary element. And she is, as I think most of you here know, one of about 30,000 children born between 1991 and 2005 by sperm or egg donation, who have no right to ever know who they are. And I think the fact that the law was changed after that is a sign and a recognition that that way of doing things was wrong. What has happened, as all of you here will know with adoption, is that similarly biological parents were promised anonymity, but the law was changed later to allow adopted children to see their original birth certificates. At the time, I remember this well, there were dire warnings that lots of people, lots of particularly Roman Catholic women would kill themselves. None of those things came to pass at all. Also, as you will know, in Victoria, in Australia, they changed the law. And that was because a young woman discovered that she had a serious genetic condition, and she sadly died of it, wanted to campaign so that her unknown siblings would have the right to know that who they were, and therefore to find out that they had potentially got this disease. And I think that whole issue of the need for people to know who they are, because we are now able as a society, if we identify diseases in time, to stop people dying from them or really suffering very badly. And the final point that I would make is that, this may not be an issue when children are very small, but from the age of 12, my daughter and other donor-conceived children that they knew started to say, not so much, I want to know who my father is, but to say, I want to know who I am, and I cannot know who I am as a person fully unless I know about my parentage. And it's wrong that that information is contained somewhere in the HFEA records for my child, but I'm not allowed to know it. And I do actually know somebody who was involved in one of these cases where somebody was given a DNA test as a present. And what happened was that it wasn't the child of that person, it was actually, it was the uncle who had donated, but thereby the whole secret of the fact that he was a donor came out. It came out absolutely chaotically, and it caused incredible distress. And really, as a civilized society, we need to organize properly donation coming out. And we need to do it because it's what the children are asking for. And we always say we put the rights of children first. But here, we're not doing anything for the rights of a child like my own. And I appeal to you to support me in saying that the law must change to help these 30,000 children, the only people in this country with no right to know who they are.
So I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, Kevin Moore. Kevin is a donor-conceived person who is in contact with his donor and an ever-growing group of half-siblings, and he is also a sperm donor. So it'd be very interesting to hear his different perspectives.
Hello. Yes, so I'm Kevin. As you can hear, I'm American by birth. I grew up in Florida. I now live in the UK. I'm a naturalized British citizen. And I also donated here. So my story spans both sides of the pond, having been born as a result of donor inception in the States and then donated here where the laws are very different. I was born in 1985, so I was probably one of the earlier generations of people who were born as a result of donor insemination. Obviously, you can see that I was the cutest baby that was born that year by far. These are a few images of my family from when I was a child. One of my mother's requirements when they were choosing a donor, it was a very interesting process back then. Basically, you just had a few ideas of what you kind of wanted the donor's description to be like. So verbally, they made sure that the donor kind of resembled my father on paper. But the key thing was that we had the donor had to have blue eyes because it's a recessive gene. Both my parents have blue eyes. Obviously, I would look out of place if I didn't have blue eyes. Obviously, that worked. But you can also see that I really resemble my mother quite strongly, as does my brother. So, I fit into the family quite well. When I was raised, I was told about the age of 7-ish that I was conceived in this manner. I didn't particularly find it interesting. I was mostly grossed out and kind of wanted to be separated from it because it just didn't really matter to me all of that much at the time. It didn't affect my relationship with my father at all. He's my dad. It doesn't really make a difference. But I was told that I would never know anything about this individual. And that always kind of sat in the back of my head because I wanted to know something about this guy. Both of my parents are medical professionals. My dad's a pediatrician. My mom is a pediatric nurse. All the rest of my family is like lawyers or other types of doctors. I work in the arts. So I thought, oh, maybe he's a little bit different, blah, blah, blah. It turns out he's actually a lawyer as well. So that didn't really answer any of my questions. But this is the piece of paper that my mother kept with information about the donor that she wrote down when they chose this individual. And she kept this piece of paper like in her safe deposit box in her bank. I didn't actually know that she had this. I asked her about it later when I was about, this was probably at least 10 years ago, something like this. And interestingly, this piece of paper, she had written down the sperm bank and also a donor code. So I was able to use this information and join the donor sibling registry. And I was immediately connected with a half-sister. And that was quite an amazing thing to happen because I wasn't expecting that to happen at all. It was very much like, I'll just do this and see if anything happens. So right away, things became very interesting very quickly. My half-sister had managed to get in touch with the sperm bank and requested some information on the sperm donor because she had recently had children herself and wanted a little bit more medical history. So they gave us this partially redacted information, which basically allowed us to find and identify the donor in about 2 hours on Google. The key thing was there was 3 different universities in the year that he graduated. With that information alone, we could go through process of elimination to find him. But there was also a few more pieces of information. So basically, we called the sperm bank. At the time, I had started donating to a sperm bank here in the UK. This is where I was living. I always wanted to become a sperm donor at some point in my life. Anyway, so they recommended that we speak to this sperm bank because this guy we should never have been able to find him. They then facilitated the contact between us and the sperm donor because we didn't want to freak him out. It went well. We sent him a letter. He sent us a letter back. Since then, we have actually met. So this is when I met my donor, and I met him along with 4 of my half-sisters. There's a bit of a resemblance there. He's a really, really sweet guy. It turns out he had recently moved from where he was living before to about an hour away from my parents, which was super random. Then there's all of us together. You'll see that I've blocked out one of my half-sister's face because she didn't want to be identifiable because it's still a bit of an issue in her family. So already you're starting to see there's a lot of different feelings about this, about who wants to be identified, who wants their information public. This is just us hanging out. The key thing that I thought was interesting for this presentation, and I've probably talked too long already, is some information about my half-siblings when they were told that they were from donor insemination, and then also how, and then also when we all connected. And the kind of overwhelming information that you can take away from this is consumer DNA testing has made a huge difference to the kind of bringing all of us together. Originally, I connected through donor sibling registry, but you can see that all of us has connected through either 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and we're also connected now to the donor and to extensively through his family as well. I became a donor. This is something that I always wanted to do since I understood that it was something that I could do. Obviously, the law here is very different, so I've been able to keep in touch with the HFEA and find out a little bit of information. This is kind of an example of the information that they have shared with me the last time I asked. So I can see that I have 14 children, which is kind of overwhelming, but also quite exciting. The years they were born, their gender at birth, and the fact that the first one will turn 18 in 2028, and they've asked me to keep in touch. Very nice. It's a pretty easy process. It's not overwhelmingly difficult. So with all of that in mind, just being very brief with the timings here, I've kind of put my thoughts about the different options that the HFEA is considering now. Status quo plus, I think this is easy, it's common sense, but I really think that this warning about DNA testing should be added to anything that involves donor conception now, because as you can tell, it's really obvious that it's here. Everybody, lots of people use it. Many people who are donor conceived use it and instantly are connected. I didn't mention when I was talking about my half siblings, but about half of them were not aware that they were donor conceived before they connected to us on 23andMe. And that was quite a process for them. And we have like a WhatsApp group that we're all members of. Our donors are a member of it, and we all talk. And so it's each time we find a new sibling, we have to like usher them into the family, so to speak, and make sure that they're not getting too much information too quickly, et cetera, et cetera. So I really think that the DNA testing needs to be addressed regardless of the result of these considerations. Early identification by consent. As a donor, that's also fine. I mean, I probably would have gone for that. That's totally okay with me. It creates a nice feeling of choice. Again, it doesn't address consumer DNA testing, and I don't really see how this is dramatically different to the double track option later. The next one was remove anonymity entirely. As a donor, and even as a donor coming from this background, I feel like this kind of makes me a little bit uncomfortable, and I feel like there's a potential that this could limit the donor pool out there. And I'm concerned that there should be some additional support from fertility clinics or the HFEA regarding early contact. It's at a point where the child is very young. The reasons behind that contact might not be fully clear. There's a lot of emotional things going on with the children at that age, perhaps with their parents at that age. I know that as a teenager, it would have been really crazy if I could have been in touch with my donor, because it would have given me all of these strange ideas to work through. And it was much better for me, from my perspective, to have all of this contact take place when I was already an adult and very well established in my personal identity. So that's my concern with that one. And then the last one, I like this. It's very nice because as a donor, I can declare my preference. I could say, yeah, I'd be happy to be contacted at any time. Or I could say, no, I would prefer to be contacted after the child is 18. I don't see how this dramatically differs from early identification by consent. And it still doesn't address consumer DNA testing, because I think that's still obviously a major issue that brings all of us together in a way that was really unexpected.
Nina is the director of the Donor Conception Network, and she has been a member of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority's Legislative Reform Advisory Group.
I've titled my presentation Boundaries and Belonging, because I think these two words may be helpful in trying to work out how to navigate these difficult conversations and decisions. To clarify some terminology and some presentation that I'm going to offer, I've identified a family as two little parents. I obviously recognise that's not the only kind of family, but just for shorthand, I'm talking about family, meaning the parents and the child they're raising, that unit. And I'm talking about boundaries, and I've used a sort of green circle. Obviously, boundaries are more fluid than that. They change, and they're not quite as rigid as presented on the screen. To clarify, we're talking about a donor, not a co-parent. So what I've really focused on in this presentation is I've taken the assumption that we might be going down this double track route, so that there might be this potential for donors to be identified very early on, and for those families to connect much earlier on. So what does that mean? And I just want to get some sort of wording clear. So if we've got families, and in the family on the left, we've got a donor. The donor is sitting on the boundary at the edge of the family, not in the family, and the child's born, and that's a separate unit. Whereas if you're talking about a co-parent, the child's born and the donor is part of that raising family. So we're not talking about that scenario. And the reason I'm stressing that is we do need to be careful with language. How are we going to explain the difference between these two different models? Where does the donor fit into the boundaries and the family? So before 2004, donors were all anonymous, as Sarah described, and really the donor was kept very apart. The assumption was that, yes, the donor is very important in creating the child, but apart from maybe telling the child about this fact, nothing more was expected from the donor. Then that was changed. There was a recognition that this was not fair, not right. Donor conceived people had needed access to information. They should be allowed to meet the donor, and indeed donors should be allowed to meet their offspring. But all of this was going to happen once a child turned 18, and the first ones turning 18 will be end of next year. So watch this space. It'll be an interesting year ahead. But it did bring the donor closer to the family. So rather than far away, the donor is now close and is potentially moving towards the family as the child grows up and becomes an adult. And with the new proposal, I think there is some clarity needed on where this donor is going to sit in terms of the boundary around the family. So we've got this connection, we've got this unit, we've got already with after post the 2004 law change, we've got parents, we've got the child and the donor, we've got the half siblings connecting through the donor. Parents obviously have their own family, we've got grandparents, cousins in the wider family, and the donor also has family, their own children and their own parents. And then we've got the families connecting through the half siblings. So there are the parents of those half siblings and all of their wider family. So we're getting a big connected network here. And then the parents may decide to have another child. That child may be donor conceived or not. They will be connected with the original child. That's the part of the family unit. But how are we going to fit all these others into any kind of boundaried sense of what the family is? Who needs to know what, how we're going to share information, what language we're going to use. And of course, that new child may have also been conceived using the help of a donor, could be a different donor, a whole new set of half siblings. The original child grows up and may have children of their own. So the picture starts to get very complicated. There's a lot of people that are potentially affected, that are potentially included, and that's where I'm talking about boundaries and belonging. Where do the boundaries lie? Who belongs where? And it's complicated. And that affects who needs to know and when, because we're assuming that we're going to be talking about this, which is assuming that we're telling the child, we're talking about the fact of having used a donor, and that sort of unleashes and releases a whole lot of information. A spoiler alert, there's not going to be an easy answer from me on exactly who needs to know what and when. I think we could probably dedicate at DC Network, we'd probably dedicate like a whole week's worth of seminars and conferences on the topic. But I'd like to also add, don't forget, we've also got medical professionals who might need to know this information. People have acquaintances, there are teachers, work colleagues, there's a woman on the bus, and there's people you don't like. Who of these need to know? Do they all need to know everything? Do none of them need to know anything? These are complicated questions, and it will be different for different people, different families, different scenarios. I think the implications of some of these decisions, some of these changes in the relationship with the donor, rely on managing people's expectations, because that's how human relationships work. I think a real potential benefit is that most of the changes seem to presume that openness is a good thing and is going to happen. So that's we would obviously at DC Network be hugely supportive of that. But there is an issue with that. You know, parents still have a lot of anxiety around using a donor. It's not an easy decision. They can be worried about who this donor is and what's their relationship to the child. And that's in the current situation when the donor is kept a bit at arm's length until the age of 18. So I'm not sure how that's going to affect confidence in parenting. Yes, half siblings will be able to grow up knowing each other from the get-go, and there could be huge benefits to that, particularly for small families where you've perhaps got you're an only child, and then suddenly you can connect with this wider group of people. Parents may really enjoy that as well. But I think there could be a lot of pressure on parents to connect and to share all the information that they have, and that may not be actually what they want. It may not be actually what's in the best interests always of the child. It's unclear. You know, you're connected connecting with these people in a very personal way. You may not share their values, you may not like them, they may not like you, the children may not get on, there may be some half siblings that really bond and others that don't. How's your child going to feel if they're not one of the ones that has bonded? So it's complicated. I think the huge benefits in fewer surprises, fewer unknowns, knowing about medical history, of course, that's going to be really useful. And the fact that the curiosity can be satisfied, as Dorothy was talking about, we hear that a lot from our families in our network, that children, as they grow up, they can be really curious and have questions that they want answers to, and they can't get them. And that's difficult for parents. But of course, with all of this opening up and making connections with people are complicated. Wishes may change, relationships may change, feelings may change, things can change for the positive. So really close bonds might form, but equally relationships may break down, and maybe the relationship with the donor won't end up being so close and so good. So what are we going to do about that? How are we going to manage people's expectations, clear boundaries, and clear sense of who belongs where? For single parents and same-sex couples where there's a conceptual missing parent, so if you've got a solo mum, there's no dad owning that word, and same for same-sex couples, I think it may be useful to have the donor as a real person, because then that's an easier thing to describe in the playground, one 5-year-old describing to another 5-year-old. But I think it also could mean that there's more complicated setting of boundaries, because you don't, when does the donor become dad? And that will need really careful management of language to help young children, particularly, to understand who is taking care of them, and who is in the boundary and out of the boundary. Language is going to be really useful. There were so many choices given, so many options, and I think the 2-track option, when there are already other options using known donors going abroad, we are going to end up with children in very different circumstances. And one of the upsides might be that the market might tell us, what do people want? Yes, it may tell us that parents really want this early identity, or maybe they don't. And that's partly why I think the 2-track gives that potential for letting people sort themselves out. With embryo donation, I think it's particularly good because you've got that really close connection. You've got those full genetic siblings growing up in another family. So those families being able to have early contact, I think, could be hugely significant and very beneficial. And just finishing, we've learned a lot from adoption. I think one of the early speakers had mentioned that, and we know that there's curiosity. We know that people, often do need to know where they've come from to feel a good sense of who they are, but it doesn't automatically mean an easy ride. And we'll have to see about the donors. What happens if we do go down this other route? Will there be more donors? Will there be fewer donors? Unknown. So it's a balancing act. We need to find a proper place for the donor. We need to integrate them into the family story. We need to respect the importance for many people of those genetic links, their wish for information, their wish for connections. We need clarity around the boundaries and the belonging. We do need some flexibility. We're talking about human relationships. They're not rigid, they're not fixed, and things change. We must respect privacy. Families will need space and time to work out who to tell and when. There aren't fixed hard rules about this, and we don't want parents to feel under pressure to do things they don't feel ready for. And I think it's getting a balance between preserving the integrity of the family and it being clear to a child where they belong, and by not overemphasizing the donor. So how you bring the donor in but not overemphasize them is going to be the art of all of this. And finally, yes, obviously, I'm going to mention support, and not just from DC Network, but yeah, we're definitely going to need extra support to help everybody navigate all of this. And that support needs to be from before child arrives and ongoing after they're born. So don't forget, DC Network's here to help. This is very much our sort of bread and butter. Like I said, I probably could have talked for hours and bored everybody, but there's a huge amount to say. And yeah, I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation.
I'm going to introduce our next speaker now, Dr. Jo Lysons. Jo is a developmental psychologist and research associate at the University of Cambridge's Centre for Family Research. And she's co-author of 2 recent research papers, one into the perspectives of children conceived via egg donation, and the other into parents who've had a child via egg donation.
So I'm going to provide some very brief insights into some parents' perspectives taken from a recent study of families created via identity release egg donation. And this study is the first in the UK to examine the psychosocial functioning of families created this way since the removal of donor anonymity in 2005. All right, so as part of this study, we really wanted to answer 2 key research questions. So firstly, we wanted to know how well parents understood the principles of identity release. And then secondly, we wanted to investigate mothers' thoughts and feelings about identity release, including the possibility of future donor-child contact. So a brief bit about the sample. We visited 61 couples, heterosexual couples who had 5-year-old children. So it's a relatively large sample for this kind of research. And these families were initially recruited through fertility clinics in the UK. And this means that the sample is fairly representative of the people receiving this kind of treatment. And so families were visited at home and parents were administered in-depth interviews asking about their perspectives on identity release egg donation. So firstly, to ascertain how well parents understood identity release egg donation, we asked them, is there anything you or your child can find out about the donor in the future? And we were actually quite surprised to find that almost 1/3 of parents did not understand that their donor would be identifiable to their child in the future. And parents' misunderstandings fell into 2 broad categories. So either they were unclear about identity release. So when we asked them, is there anything you'll be able to find out in the future? They said, I don't know, or I'm not sure, I'll need to go and check. Otherwise, they believed their donor was completely anonymous, so they didn't think their child would ever be able to know the donor's identity. So this brings us to our second research question. So amongst those that do understand about identity release, what are mothers' thoughts and feelings about identity release? So mothers' narratives were analysed using a thematic analysis, and we found that their perspectives fell into sort of 3 broad groups. And mothers' perspectives were distributed fairly evenly between the 2 extremes of identity release as a threat, here in red, and embracing identity release in blue. And then there was a small subgroup in the middle who were fairly neutral, and that was captured by the theme acceptance, it is what it is. So there were 11 sub-themes in the full analysis, so I'm just going to talk you through 6 of these today, as I feel they provide a really nice insight into the complexity of this data. So firstly, some mums in this sample saw identity release as a threat, and they did so in different ways and for different reasons. But most commonly, identity release was represented as having the power to sort of weaken or challenge the mother-child relationship. And often mums felt that any interest from the child in the future in the donor would indicate that they somehow failed in their role as a mother. And for some, this was expressed as a fear that the donor-child relationship would be more sort of real than their own relationship with their child. So as we can see from this quote from Colleen, she said, I'd be worried that they'd suddenly have this unbelievable connection that perhaps is truer of a biological mother. And perhaps what we've got isn't a true mother-son relationship. I don't know, it worries me. Secondly, for some mums, identity release was felt as a threat to the child. So this ranged sort of from worries that the donor might hurt or take advantage of the child, to concerns that the actual process of finding out the donor's identity might be challenging for their child in the future. And I think it's important to point out at this point that all of these concerns are really compounded by the fact as the identity release system is still relatively new in the UK, there's a real dearth of information about the rates and quality of donor-child contact. So as one mum succinctly put it, even the experts don't know how it would go. And then thirdly, a handful of mums felt that identity release actually posed a threat not to the child, but to the donor. So a lot of these mothers expressed, some very real gratitude that they felt towards the donor, and implied that any contact from their child in the future would disrupt the donor's personal life, which is not something that they didn't want. So as Audrey says here, I think she was probably a 20-year-old who wanted to help and might have her own life now and her own kids. I wouldn't want to rock the boat, as it were. Okay, so moving swiftly on to the other extreme. So this is where, rather than feeling threatened, some mums actively embraced identity release and the possibility of contact with the donor. And in doing so, a lot of these mothers emphasised their children's rights. So they felt that the donor's identity was information that sort of fundamentally belonged to the child. So again, this is illustrated by Byrne, who says, although they'll have me as their mum, genetically they'll always be, you know, just information that they want about themselves. And I think it's important that they have access to that information. Secondly, some mums expressed a personal desire for contact with the donor. So there's quite a lot of sort of variability within this. So this sort of range from having a general sense of curiosity about the donor to maybe wanting to send her a message of thanks, all the way up to wanting to meet the donor and sort of show their child to them. And interestingly, within this, we found sort of a small subgroup of mothers who felt that there wasn't enough information made available to them about the donor at the point of treatment. And again, this ranged quite a lot. So some mums sort of wished for personal information about the donor, like her likes and dislikes or her career and educational background. Quite a few mums mentioned wishing they had a more comprehensive medical history that they could give to their child. And then a handful of mums really expressed regret that there wasn't an opportunity for earlier contact between the donor and their child so that they could develop a relationship. So like Orla said here, I would have liked to have just been able to meet up for a cup of coffee or at a park or something. To introduce them gradually would be better than not knowing. It might be easier for them. It might not be such a shock and such a big thing of, oh, I'm going to meet the person that could have been my mother. Okay, so finally, many mums viewed the identity release as a gateway to sort of accessing a wider family network. And for some mums, the value of identity release was not only in enabling their child to contact the donor, but also to trace same donor offspring. And this was often described as quite an exciting prospect. And then a small number of mums actually viewed the donor and any potential donor siblings as a potential support network in the event of their own death. So, for example, one mother, Tabitha, observed that it would be tragic if she and her husband were to die without their child having first made contact with the donor, as she anticipated that my child would need contact then and hope that there might be somebody there who's got a little space for her. Okay, so to conclude, we found in our study that surprisingly, a significant minority of parents were actually unaware of the fact that their donor would be identifiable to their child in the future. And we found that amongst those that did understand identity release, mums had a really diverse range of feelings about the prospect of contact with the donor, with some feeling very threatened by it and others really yearning for it. And for those of you that are interested in reading the full analysis, I've provided the reference to the open access article at the top of this slide. But what I think these findings really demonstrate, and as others have already mentioned, that this is a very complex issue and that a one-size-fits-all solution may be quite difficult to find. And just a final thought, I think it's important to say that what we don't know from this research is how the parents' feelings about this will change over time. So obviously this was a sample of parents with children who are only 5 years old. It will be particularly important to investigate how parents feel about this when their children are approaching the age at which they can access their donor's information. And it'll be equally important to collect data on how donor-conceived children themselves feel about having an identity release donor.
So I want to move now to our final speaker this evening, Professor Guido Pennings. And Guido is Professor of Ethics and Bioethics at Ghent University and Director of the Bioethics Institute, Ghent. He is author of commentary on donor identifiability and co-author of a recent research paper into sperm donation and sperm donor perspectives on identity release.
I think that what distinguishes me most from the others is that I'm not UK. And it may seem astonishing, but I think this makes a huge difference because things that may seem self-evident to you are not at all self-evident to me. So what I've done is I've tried to take a very broad look at the evolution of the last few years, let's say the last 2 decades, and about where this is going and what is underlying it. First of all, let us look at the rules of donor anonymity and the way they function. So to make it very simple, the rules of donor anonymity indicate what kind of relationships the donor and the recipient want with each other and with the child. Now, that means that the child obviously is not the direct party, but the child is obviously, as for all reproduction, represented by the parents. In fact, the fact that you are donor conceived is also a decision taken by the parents. So as soon as a country introduces a law about donor anonymity, so it may be either for or against, it doesn't matter, they are in fact overruling the right of the parents to decide about their family life. And if you look at it from this perspective, the best solution to reduce state intrusion is to introduce a multi-track system. So it resembles the multi-track system that was discussed earlier, but this one is in fact completely different in the sense that you leave the donor and the recipients 3 options, meaning anonymous, identifiable, and known. So both parties choose one of these 3 and can decide what to do in the future. But so as soon as you look at this as an agreement, you will realize that in fact, all the direct-to-consumer genetic testing and stuff that we are seeing these days does not change anything in terms of the function of this agreement. This is an agreement that was made between the 2 parties that were present and that should be respected. Now, as was mentioned earlier, we did a survey among 233 sperm donors recruited through Cryos International. And Cryos International is special because they are located in Denmark, and Denmark has the possibility to have both ID release and non-ID release donors. And as you can see, among this sample, 63%, so 2 out of 3 were ID release and 1 out of 3 were non-ID release. Now, we knew from the counselors that they were explicitly told, all the donors, that there was going to be the possibility to be identified to direct-to-consumer genetic testing. And so the question then was, why did the 1/3 that want to be anonymous, why did they still donate? Because obviously this was in contradiction with the information they were provided. And these are some of the answers that were given by the non-ID release donors. Either they didn't believe that the risk of being identified was high, and in fact they may be right about that, by the way, it still remains to be proven. They hoped that their preference for non-identification would be respected by the recipients. They believed that because of their choice, they were under no obligation to accept any contact with donor offspring, and they believed that the impact on their lives would be limited. Now, as you can see from this information, is that in fact, what they look at this as an agreement, and they believe that their future contact with the child, whether or not they're going to accept contact, whether or not they're going to provide information, will largely depend on the position that they have adopted. So in fact, the direct-to-consumer genetic testing does not really change the attitude towards the recipients or towards the donor offspring. Now, what strikes me as an ethicist in this case is that people make claims without foundations. So to justify a right in general, one needs to show that there is an interest. Now, an interest is shown when an essential goal in life cannot be reached or is hampered because of the lack of something. Now, if you look at all the scientific evidence that's being provided, you can see that no such argument can be made for the right to know one's genetic origins. So on the contrary, all scientific evidence shows that information on genetic origin is not necessary to have a normal life and to function well. No differences were found on child well-being, psychological adjustment, and parent-child relationships. I just put 2 references here. Obviously, the work by Susan Colombok and the work by Nicole Caron have been showing this over and over again. So the question then is, where is the foundation for the right? Now, as soon as you do not longer provide the foundation, it means that the whole question of why this abolition of donor anonymity has been introduced can be brought back to an ideological measure. And more importantly, if you do not provide a foundation for this right, that means that you do not have any barrier to the introduction of new rights. And one such right, and I'm 100% sure that this is going to be one that is going to be brought forward in the near future, is the right to be raised by one's genetic parents. In fact, this is the logical continuation of the right to know your genetic origins. And so, again, how are you going to say that children do not have this right? So in general, donor anonymity is the focus of an ideological battle between two ideologies of the family. The bionormative ideology, family is based on genetic relationships, and we've seen that in one of the presentations. All the families that were brought in were only related through genetics. So that is what you get here. And then you have the socio-normative ideology, which relies on the family as a psychosocial, based on psychosocial relationships, which is in fact the foundation of the whole practice of gamete donation. So this whole ideological debate is hidden behind the veil of the welfare of the child. And now look at what has happened over the last few years. Originally, in order to promote the welfare of the child only had to know that it was donor conceived. A bit later, it had to have access to non-identifiable information. Then it had to find out the name of the donor. Then it had to have personal contact with the donor. Then it had to have regular personal contact with the donor. And now it has to have regular contact with the donor from an early age. Now, what we see happening here is very simple. Every step brings the genetic parent back into the family and reconstitutes the biological family, which is exactly what the bionormative ideology values. But all this, of course, for the well-being of the children. So if we then go to the last measure that is being debated, lowering the age at which donor offspring can obtain the name of the donor, is in fact a very nice illustration of how the bionormative ideology is gaining ground. Now, the influence of the ideology here is more visible than in other cases because there's no evidence whatsoever that such change would be in the best interest of the donor offspring, let alone of donor families. But evidence made no difference before, so why should it do now?
So the first question is from Hayley Darknell, and she wonders how much consultation the HFEA have had with the UK adult donor conceived community regarding these options or potential law changes. She says, I personally feel that this is important to get the views from a range of donor conceived individuals, different cultures, family setups, stage of disclosure, gender, etc., etc. And Hayley adds that she's a donor conceived adult and also a recipient parent to donor conceived children. Okay, Nina, do you want to go for that one first? Because you've actually been on the HFEA's committee, and then we can take it from there with perhaps the other speakers might want to have views on who they think should be involved in these discussions.
Yes, I mean, I think it would be enormously helpful for the HFEA to engage specifically with donor conceived people and bring in a wide range of views. If is that the question you're asking, or whether they have? I think that's what Hayley was asking, which I'm not sure. I don't think they have specifically targeted donor conceived people for their thoughts and feedback on the proposals.
Really, to reiterate what Nina said and the person in the chat, I think it would be really important to collect donor conceived people's perspectives and children's perspectives at different ages. I think at kind of different points, you know, those that are on the precipice of being able to access donors' information, those who are maybe a bit younger, and those that might have started the process next year. But also, I think, as the question asker mentioned, from different ethnic groups, from different sorts of communities, because there will be different priorities and different sort of risks and things at stake for different groups.
And Kevin, with your two hats, what do you think about getting involved? In some ways, you know, you could tie up quite a few questions in one person. Although as soon as I've said that, I'm regretting it, because you only represent your own views and not those of a wider range of people, because everyone has slightly different views and expectations, as Neela so elegantly sort of expressed in her talk.
Yes, of course. I mean, I'm always a fan of gathering as much information as possible on these things, and especially consulting with a wide as possible variety of people at different ages, different situations. I mean, even from within my own family and an extended family, every single half sibling has a different story and a different background. And I think it's the more of those stories we can gather before making decisions, the more widely applicable those decisions will be.
A question for Dorothy from someone considering being a known egg donor. Would your daughter have liked to meet her biological father and for him to be part of her life, or does she simply want to know information about him? Quite a difficult question for you to answer on behalf of your daughter, perhaps.
Well, I can sort of answer that. It's not actually, she has told me that she wants her father to be part of her life. It's that she wants to know who he was or is, because she says, only if I know who my father is, can I truly know who I am. She is interested in knowing her half siblings, and I hope that one day that might be possible. But she doesn't express a desire to have a relationship with her father. She expresses a desire to know who she is.
I think we'll move on from that question to one from Zeynep Gerten. She's a question for you, Kevin. Firstly, she's very grateful to you for sharing your story. Do you think there is a difference in your half siblings' attitudes depending on whether they grow up knowing about the method of conception versus those that found out through chance and genetic testing?
Yeah, well, there definitely is a difference in feelings amongst all of us. One of the half siblings who's kind of gave me some info on when they found out and everything has a twin sister who doesn't want to have anything to do with the wider group and doesn't want to know about the donor, doesn't want to be in touch with any of the half siblings, but he does, and he's in our little WhatsApp group, and that's very much a family discussion between the two of them. They, I think, weren't aware of the circumstances until they found out via 23andMe. So they had their own situation. Others who weren't aware, obviously were very shocked, had to have some serious conversations with their parents, but seem to have come around to it and aren't having a sort of a negative reaction to it. They're very much part of the group, and we all chat, and most of us have met. And then I think those of us who, I mean, I'm one of the only, I think one of two who knew from an early age, and our attitude is fairly similar in that we're like, okay, well, it's fine. It's part of what we knew growing up, so it wasn't a big deal. But yes, definitely, depending on the age and the way in which each of us found out, everybody's had their own sort of reaction. But it's a larger picture as well, because it depends on the family dynamics, their relationship with their parents already. But yeah, the short answer is definitely yes. It has differed depending on circumstances.
Nina, whether there's anything you want to add there from a donor conception network perspective.
Well, I think Kevin's put it very eloquently that there's lots of different views. We're all individuals, and surprise, surprise, and so all have different. We'll interpret things differently, and we'll feel differently about our situation. So, but yes, I think the one thing to say is that the impact of genetic testing, so talking about sort of late told or early told, the impact of genetic testing is more that any child conceived today will know whether the parents raising them are genetically related to them or not. They may not find their donor, they may not know anything else, they may not discover any more information, but they will know that. And that's partly why openness is so important. And once you start being open, once you tell a child that they're donor conceived, it's very understandable that there'll be curiosity about who is that person. So I don't think it's, I suppose I'm sort of saying that partly to come back perhaps to Professor Pennings, to say, I don't know that I wouldn't agree that it's an ideological position. I think it's a sort of practical one. And certainly if it was my slide around the genetic family that you were referring to, I'm guessing it was, I think I was trying to make the opposite point, just to be clear, that yes, of course, there are, genetic related, but I didn't specify some of those family relationships might not be genetic. They may be adopted children or stepchildren. But what I'm saying is there's this web of people that might, broadly speaking, might call family, and they relate to each other differently, and they have different genetic connections. Actually, a lot of them aren't genetically related, but would call themselves absolutely family. And there might be people you're genetically very closely related to that you don't consider family.
So the next question is from Michael Green, and he says the donor-conceived child hasn't signed an anonymity contract and so has no obligation to abide by it and could search via DNA research for her donor. Also, the law as written in GB is dependent on the raising parents telling their child that they're donor-conceived, thus negating the right to know.
If the child doesn't know that they're donor conceived, then they can't do anything about contacting the donor. And this was something that actually some of the parents in my study brought up as one of their concerns, was that there is this sort of tension, that 18-year waiting period, where if I tell my child early, they might resent me if I don't have this information to give to them before they're 18. For a couple of mums, they actually said, I'm not going to tell them until much later because of that. So it certainly is an issue that is it depends whose perspective you're looking at it from, in terms of sort of, the parent or the child. We've seen that some parents, and in this case, in my study, mums, some of them do feel quite a lot of threat, and actually maybe that 18-year waiting period will allow the parent-child relationship to develop and solidify, and they'll become confident in their parenting role. But on the other hand, if we're being encouraged to disclose early, and the most of my parents in this study either had started disclosing or intended to disclose, then there's that tension between those children being told and then not being able to access information until they're much older.
Does anyone else on the panel want to come in on that one? Kevin?
I obviously am not coming from an academic background, but I can speak to my own experience. As also both of my parents were medical professionals, they got some advice at the beginning when all of this, they were making this decision, and they were told at the time to disclose early, much like you would at the time, disclose early if you had adopted your child, so that they can grow up with that knowledge as part of their identity and not have it be a surprise. It's not a kind of elephant in the room for the parents that, this is going on and they have to tell the child at some point. And also it's kind of the malleability of the child's mind. I mean, when you're told something like this when you're 7, I mean, you're just kind of like, okay, yeah, gross, whatever. And you move on with your relationships. And in my family, it was not a taboo subject. I could ask questions. Obviously, they told me they had very little information, but I could keep asking if I wanted to. I could talk about it out loud and say, I wonder if the sperm donor is like this. I wonder if he does this. And we could have these conversations, and it wasn't taboo. And so therefore it actually was never really that big of a deal. To touch on the other point where it's up to the parents then to tell children, now, one of my half siblings obviously didn't know, mentioned to her parents that she was going to do a DNA test. They didn't say anything, got the results back, and was like, well, do we need to have a chat about this? And there were, I think, about over 2 to 3 weeks that she was chatting with us, being like, my parents are denying it. And I'm like DNA doesn't lie. This is the situation. Let's have an open conversation. And so they had to kind of go through that all together and get to the point where they could talk openly about it. And I think that, again, it's an issue with the DNA testing that's available. If someone decides when they haven't been told, but they're 20 and they want to do one of these DNA tests to find out about their history or any of the other reasons why you might do one of these DNA tests, because some people find it interesting, this information will become available, and it's then it becomes an even more awkward conversation, I would say, from my experience with my siblings.
Question for someone who's chosen to be anonymous. With the double track idea, do you think that the child's parents may choose to find the donor and lead to a relationship that possibly the donor conceived child themselves may be too young to consent to and not actually want? I think it gets quite knotty when you think about children and consenting, because obviously parents make lots of decisions for their children that they don't consent to, which school they go to, whatever it is, but there are lots of things like that, certainly in the early years. So Nina, I think we'll go to you first on this one.
Yeah, I probably hinted at this in the presentation. It's so hard to go into detail in 8 minutes. So yes, I think that it's, you know, these are relationships, as the word in the question, and relationships are complicated. So yeah, you will find that some of these connections will potentially result in very close, happy, wonderful connections, and others may be more problematic, and some may be actually good and then change. Something may happen that means that the relationship breaks down. So our position at DC Network, I think, would always be that parents need to choose what they feel is right for them, because they're the ones that are going to have to justify their decisions, rather than trying to assume that they know what's going to happen, what the outcome is going to be, and work on that basis for their child. Yes,
Okay.
there are pitfalls with all routes, I think.
Yep. Guido, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, it's a very interesting one, in the sense that I've been following the debate on this, the question of whether or not the information should be revealed earlier. And it's very interesting to look at the debate that is currently being kept at in the Netherlands, because they in fact are not taking the perspective of what is going to be in the best interest of the child, but they are looking at whether or not the child is capable of understanding it. Now, I think that, of course, that question makes it a completely different one, because we're talking about, in fact, the whole question of having decisional authority, and of course all the things that are related to that. But that would also mean that an external expert would then have an interview with a child, see whether the child understands it at the age of, let's say, 10, and then decide that the child can have information about the donor, identifiable information. Now, what is interesting about this perspective is that, and that is also the case in a number of others, is that you in fact completely separate the child from the others. The child is the bearer of a right. It understands the question, and it says that it wants to have X. And so that means that you have to give the child X. So in this case, the name of the donor and the possibility of contact. And no one really looks at what the parents think about this. So it's interesting to see that apparently this kind of consideration is taken into account in the UK, but it is not in the Netherlands. So we will have to see how it works out. But for me, the most astonishing thing is the fact that you think about the child as a right bearer independently of the family. And we know from a number of recent studies where the children have gotten information, look for instance at Sweden, where you can find that there are conflicts now in the family because the child contacted the donor and the father does not want to know anything about the whole thing. And so the question then is, what is the benefit here and who benefits? And now imagine that this is going to happen when the child is 12. So I think this is a very interesting question, but this is more a question of how do you look at the child, or do you look at the family? And if you think that the child is no longer a part of the family, then you get a different answer.
Interesting point. Joe, did you want to come in on this one?
It is an interesting point, and I don't think I have a particularly well thought through response. It depends how you look at how you consider a child, and I suppose we go back to your question, Guido, of who benefits. What would the benefit of have a child having access to this information earlier than the age of 18. And I think all I can say to that is we need to ask those people, we need to ask the donor conceived people, actually, what information is it you want? We don't know whether the children who have been conceived using identity release donation, whether they are, and assuming they've been told, whether they are happy with the idea of, actually, I will, and assuming they want to know the donor's identity, whether they're happy to know, to wait until they're age 18. I think there are some preliminary findings somewhere that suggest that might be the case, that they go, okay, well, I'll have to wait until I'm 18 to find this information. I have to wait until I'm technically an adult. But we don't know whether actually they're not comfortable with that, and actually they'd rather know now. I think that's the only way I could answer that, is to say, defer to their perspectives, and I don't have any data on that yet. So we need more data.
Sarah, can
yes,
I?
Guido?
Because I think it's an interesting question. A number of amongst, I think that both the HFEA and the organization in the Netherlands both refer to the fact that they need more information, and then they all refer to the stakeholders and so on. So let us now look at the whole field of gamete donation. Then you will see that there is, amongst the donor conceived, amongst the donors, and amongst the recipients, a huge diversity of views. So I don't think that this is going to be any different. You will find 10% who thinks it's very beneficial. You have 10% who finds that it's very harmful, and then you have a whole middle group who doesn't really know what to do. So let's think about this in the same lines. This is probably going to be the outcome. Now what? Now what do you conclude? From a normative point of view, what is going to be your decision? Are you going to say there's 10% who find this beneficial, so we're going to change the law? Or how are you going to do this? This is ethics by survey. And I find this very interesting, because I think that you have no clue about what to do with the findings, because there won't be 99% like in Russian elections that's going to say, yes, we absolutely want this.
So I'm going to go with Natalie Gamble while she's still at the top. She says, Natalie Gamble is a lawyer, for those who don't know her, specialising in this area. And she says, we've seen some very messy legal disputes between known donors and recipient parents, which end up in the family court, sometimes for years, causing misery for all, but most importantly for the children. While I support more openness and the rights of donor-conceived people to know their identity, this is the risk of fully open donation. What support can help prepare parents and donors for managing relationships while the children are young? So I think perhaps as a support group, we'll go to the Donor Conception Network and Nina first, and then take it from there.
Well, it's interesting. I think in the office, we often say that the families, through where they have a known donor, it can either be a really great outcome because there's no sort of loose ends, and it's sort of tidy, and people can answer questions that need answering, and if they don't ask questions, that's fine. But we also see the opposite end, that probably they are the most, as Natalie's describing, when it doesn't go well, they're the hardest ones and the most problematic for all concerned. I don't know what the answer is. I think the answer, people are making decisions about how they create their families, and those decisions have certain implications and perhaps certain sort of responsibilities attached, but you don't know what the outcomes are going to be. So all we can do, I think, is to support people in making the best decisions that they can make for themselves. So that requires a lot of pre-thinking, a lot of potentially counselling, but certainly peer support to have spaces to talk about what people are feeling, what people are thinking about and choosing, speak to other people who've done something similar to at least put them in the best possible position to make a really good decision for themselves. And then going forward, it is the family unit that, we're always talking about families. We talk about parents because we think of ourselves as parent-led and child-focused, family-oriented. It's the whole unit, and yes, I think it always seems to come down to more support, but you can't predict everything. Human relationships are complicated.
I have not an answer, but another question, or just a general musing. I think this came up well when we kind of realised that a sort of a significant proportion of parents didn't understand that their donor was identifiable, and kind of thinking about when and at what point they're supposed to be informed or learn that. There was some discussion around kind of the sort of mandatory counselling session that they receive at the fertility clinic, and whether there could be some additional provision at that point, or potentially a sort of post-conception. Because I think a lot of parents, when they're kind of going through that initial counselling session and they're at the point of treatment, they will be focused very much on getting pregnant and conceiving, and it's very possible that absorbing all that information, including kind of like the legislation surrounding donor identifiability, is just going to be too much. So I strongly feel that there ought to be at least one, ideally many more counselling sessions after that. Obviously the big question is who pays for it, and I think, though I can't remember which report I read, but someone sort of recommended that there should be at least one additional counselling session post-conception provided by the clinic, which is built into the overall cost. Again, that does still pass it on to the patient, but it would be something. So yeah, I wonder whether there could be some extra provision at that point too.
And I suppose, Kevin, as a donor, what would, with your donor hat on, I suppose, what would you expect if you were in this sort of situation where you were going to be identifiable or known, in effect, from a much earlier stage in the child's life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. From an earlier stage in the child's life, what kind of support? I think it would be nice to, like, if there's an initial introduction, or I mean, I don't know how it works now with the HFEA when the children can request my information, whether or not they just get it and then, I mean, do I get a phone call and an email? Like, what happens? Or does someone from the HFEA call me and say, okay, this information has been requested and it's been given, so you can expect that? I don't know what the procedure is now. If with that in mind, what I would like is that someone would let me know that, okay, there's this child that is this age, their parents have requested to be in touch, or the child is actually requested to be in touch for these reasons. And we would like to facilitate an initial kind of conversation in some way. I think the idea of someone showing up out of the blue, completely unexpected, is a little bit jarring. Not that I don't expect to be contacted at some point, because I've done the same to contact my donor, but the fact is that the sperm bank in the US kind of facilitated that and made it a less emotionally kind of scary situation, because they stood in the middle between that initial contact. And I think that something similar would be helpful in this circumstance as well.
It's some sort of, mediation to facilitate that first contact and connection, and
even just like a phone call from someone saying, okay, this information has been requested and given, you should expect to be contacted sometime soon. Just like a warning, like, because the idea of someone just showing up like on the phone, at the door, whatever, it's such a jar from like what your kind of day-to-day existence is like, that it would definitely be nice to have some sort of warning about that, just so you can emotionally prepare yourself for that as well.
Okay, right. A very popular comment from Petra Nordquist, who is an academic who's done research in this area. Our empirical study with egg and sperm donors shows that a lot of different approaches among donors, including a real sense of affinity along lines, e.g. to their recipients, are not currently recognised in law. What do you think? Could and should the law go further?
Should the law go further is maybe a question I'm not best placed to answer, because I'm going to sit on the fence and just say it just depends on whose perspective you look at it from. By mutual consent sounds like it could be a good place to start, but then again, whose consent are we talking about? The recipient parents and the donor? What about the child, and are they able to assent to that properly? Yeah.
We have a question from Olivia for Guido, for Olivia Montucci, who's been heavily involved with the Donor Conception Network, a founder member many years ago. How many donor-conceived people are known to Guido Pennings? Does he have any idea of how many of them, including my own daughter, feel a lack of not knowing one half of her genetic origins? So, Guido.
Yes, I think this is a completely irrelevant question for the simple reason that, as we've just heard, there's a variety of views. And Kevin also made the same remark, some people are very interested, others are not. So why do we always choose the one who are interested? Second, we have no clue how many of them are really looking for the donor. We have no clue. All the samples that are being done are done on completely biased samples. You go to the donor conception web bank, to the donor sibling registry, whatever. So that's like going into a church and asking how many people are Catholic. So you don't know. So there might be a small number, but they are very outspoken, or there may be many. But in fact, there is no scientific evidence whatsoever. So, and knowing someone does not really matter in this case. As I've said before, if you have a diversity of opinions, what are you going to do about it? Some people want it, some people don't. So why do I choose the one of those who don't want it? So that's an equally valid position. You have a diversity of views. Now the question is, what are you going to do in terms of policy? And the solution is not self-evidently that you're going to follow one party and not the other. So I don't see why this would be relevant if I would know 1, 10, or 50, because they would all be ones being self-selected coming forward.
That answers that question. Next question is from Patricia Gilbert. Kevin sees his dad as his dad. From discussions with those who are donor conceived, has there been discussion about how the donor is referred to? Nina raised the point about language within families who use donor conception. At what age does the child begin to see the donor as dad? With regard to those conceived following egg donation, is there the same language emphasis, donor mothers? So I'm going to go to Joe first on that one, because I think that probably ties in most to your research.
Yeah, and there's certainly there's some really lovely language, and there's some really nice research that came out of Susan's team, or maybe nearly 10 years ago now. But there's some really lovely language that has developed. So I'm thinking actually about surrogacy terms, tummy mummy and sorrow sister, things like that, which are very kind of family-oriented terms. We are analysing the data, actually looking at kind of the talking and telling kind of experiences that our sample have recently had. And I think the mothers that I've spoken to were quite broadly quite careful not to use the term mother or egg mother. It would be more the kind of main phrase that came out was sort of a kind lady, and it's kind of like it will be stories that are kind of like, you know, she had, my eggs were broken and she had a spare one, so she gave it to me. So it's not very family oriented language. It's more about kindness and and generosity and how loved and special you are. So certainly I can say that from my sample. The children, we weren't able to interview about their perceptions of it, because they were just a little bit too young. We started interviewing them with some really lovely hand puppets, and we're interviewing them about their kind of their well-being and their perspectives on the parent-child relationship. But also amongst that, we're able to ask them, is your family, do you think, different or the same as other families? And this is a paper that's been published. And what was really interesting was to see what they felt was sort of saliently different about their family. So as I said, that was different. You know, it was stuff like, we've got a bigger house, or we don't have any siblings, or we don't have any cats, or, you know, things like that. So certainly at age 5, that's what was important to the kids. But yeah, we weren't able to interview them on the language that they're using just yet. Hopefully in the future.
Well, for me, language is also quite heavily based in emotion. So I find terms like dad and father quite emotional, and I would not use those terms with my donor because I don't have that kind of emotional relationship with him. I refer to him as either his name, or like before we knew his name, we've referred to him as bio dad or some other things that I can't say right now that were pejorative and really funny, just to make light of the situation. But amongst my half siblings, there's only one who currently refers to him as dad, and that was a conscious decision that she sort of announced to all of us, and we were like, great, cool for you. He was comfortable with that. I know that made his wife uncomfortable, and there was a lot of discussion about it amongst all of us, with her, with him. He has his own kids as well. So, you know, there is a lot of emotional attachment to these different terminologies. And I think it is quite interesting, but I wouldn't say that at any certain point is there like oh, okay, this is when you start referring to the donor as dad or mom or whatever. I think that's a very emotional and particular, individually particular kind of situation.
That's really interesting, Kevin. You know, that whole difference with with your half siblings, and I think that's really fascinating. Thanks for that. So the next question is from Ruth Wild. So she says, some of you have mentioned the need for support services. I'm interested in the panel's view about whose responsibility it is to provide support services: the state, the charity sector, fertility clinics, the direct-to-consumer sites, or should donor-conceived people and all those affected by donation have to fund this to support for themselves? If it's the state, does this extend to people making connections or wanting to when they were donor-conceived from non-UK clinics? Because obviously lots of people in the UK will have used egg donors from Spain or sperm donors from wherever. So who should pick up the bill for this, I suppose, is what she's asking, and provide the service. So let's go to Nina first. What does the Donor Conception Network think?
I can't. Well, yes, I would say that I'm slightly hesitant about the taxpayer having to fund it. That feels slightly strange, particularly as it seems like it's a potentially never-ending requirement, limitless requirement. I certainly think that the charity sector has a really important role. We know the value of the work that we're doing with supporting parents, both before treatment, during treatment, having children, building the family, and then having adult donor conceived children themselves. So yeah, I think it's probably the fertility clinics, and given the amount of money the direct-to-consumer DNA testing sites are making, they could support us a bit.
More than one speaker has mentioned that there may be fewer donors if the law changes. If the interest of the donor offspring is paramount, does this matter? So who wants to tackle that one first? Perhaps we'll go to Guido because he's not spoken for a little while.
Strictly speaking, this is correct. If you say that the welfare of the child is paramount, then it does not matter how many donors there are. Obviously, it's not as simple as that, because if you have few donors, then what is going to happen? So what we see now, and this is another technological development, is that everyone goes on the internet. So no control, nothing whatsoever in terms of support. And so that's the consequence of, first of all, the price of the treatment, which can be considerable if you have to pay for this yourself, even for a simple donor insemination. And secondly, because you have a long waiting list or very little choice. So then the question becomes, is the welfare of the child paramount if you have few donors and everyone goes on the internet? I think the answer would be no. So then the next question is, how are you going to balance these? So I think it might be very useful to have within the regulated system a sufficient number of donors so that you can keep people in-house, where you have at least some way of accompanying them along the process. Or you can have just a very strict view and be catering to what, 5 or 10% of the people, and all the rest is going online or abroad. So I think that is the consideration you have to make. But if you put it very simple, yes, then it does not matter. But I think the consequences are slightly more complicated than presented here.
Yeah, there've certainly been a number of stories in the British media about finding sperm donors online, and some rather quite unpleasant practices, and women endangering themselves in certain situations as well. So, you know, I think that is a potential risk of a decline in donor numbers. It's already happening now. So whether that situation will get worse, one would think it may do, but it's difficult to predict. Oh, got quite a long one next from someone who's anonymous. I'm a single woman approaching first round of IVF with donor sperm, and she's a member of Donor Conception Network, Nina. So that's good. I can't help but worry that the emphasis Nina put on retaining the integrity of the family is underpinned by the same core fears that have informed previous approaches, now widely regarded as harmful. It seems to be premised on a belief that we can and we should try to control emotional outcomes, and that protecting the status of the parents is a priority. My reading has led me to believe that if I go down this path, I have to accept up front that my family will inevitably be subject to this particular type of uncertainty and potential disruption. But all families have to deal with uncertainty and disruption, and must work to make good relations, whatever the cause is.
Particularly a young child, but children need to know who is looking after them, who is cooking them tea and putting them to bed and making decisions on their behalf. So that's what I'm calling the family. And I think the point I was trying to make is that if you're bringing the donor in as a real person early, so this is a man or a woman with a name who might actually be meeting the parents, that you just need real clarity to say, where is the boundary between the family unit and this donor? Where do you place the donor in this story? And I would say you want to try to maintain that integrity of the family separate from the donor, so that the child is not confused by who's looking after them and who's responsible for them.
In response to this, I think there's a lot that we can take from the adoption literature on this, on kind of more recent conceptualizations of what it means to be open with regards to adoption. And I think more recent studies have shown that communicative openness rather than structural openness, so structural openness meaning having contact with the birth family, but more communicative openness, which means sort of being able to manage those, help your child manage those boundaries, like that Nina was just talking about, in age appropriate ways and at sort of developmentally appropriate stages, is excuse me, much more reliably related to better child outcomes in the future. So I suppose I wonder whether what the question asker was asking is, do we have to view donor conception parenthood as a sort of special kind of parenthood in the same way that adoptive parenthood has a kind of additional or different sort of expectations and kind of boundary management involved in it, and possibly yes.